Good afternoon and welcome to the Carnegie Council Lunchtime webinar series. Like many of you, we're working remotely these days, so we're using this time to reach out to our senior fellows, friends, and constituents to talk about the important issues in ethics in public life that are at the heart of the Council's work. So thank you all for joining us. Today's topic is Democracy on the Verge, Leadership in Times of Crisis. And this title is a play on the title of the new book, Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington, written by our good friend and Carnegie Council Fellow, Ted Widmer. It's great to see you, Ted.
Thank you, Joel. Great to be here.
I'm going to let Ted describe the book, but I will say at the outset, it's really a thriller. The book is cinematic, it's philosophical, it's a great story, and for me, it's inspirational. Like all of Ted's work, Lincoln on the Verge uses the past to enlighten the present and to suggest a better future. Now, this is not a bad formula for understanding the intersection of ethics and public policy. For this and for many other reasons, I'm grateful to Ted for his own leadership in our field. In addition to his career as a writer, scholar, and teacher, Ted has been a White House speechwriter and a State Department historian. He's witnessed the messy, real-time compromises of democracy in action. And as Max Weber put it, politics is a strong and slow boring of hard boards. It takes both passion and perspective. In this way, Ted, along with Lincoln, reminds us that ethics is not merely about dreams, but also about making hard choices. We've asked Ted to relate some of the lessons of his new book, as well as his personal experiences, to the current moment. Specifically, we've asked him, how should we be thinking about the health and well-being of democracy these days, especially as it is challenged by the urgencies of the pandemic and the deeper fault lines of polarization? Now, before turning it over to Ted, just a word about our format. We've asked Ted to kick things off with a short presentation. After that, Ted and I will have a bit of a dialogue, and the back half of the program will be interactive. So please use your chat function to pose questions as we go. And our moderator, Alex Woodson, will read the questions on your behalf. So now over to you, Ted. Congratulations on the book. And perhaps you could just kick us off with some brief reflection on the book and how it meets the moment.
Thank you so much, Joel. What a lovely introduction. And I want to thank you and the Carnegie Council for being such good friends for now quite a few years. I think I met Joel about 20 years ago. We were both friends with a great historian who was also an ethicist and a careful student of current events and foreign policy. And that was James Chase, who was a very good friend of both of us. And he knew that you can't really study the current political environment without a sense of history, and also knowing where we are as a nation now, paradoxically, it can inform the writing of history. And the present was often on my mind as I did this pretty deep immersion in a 2-week period in February 1861. We are a divided country now, as everyone knows. We're divided in many ways, not just Republicans and Democrats. And the Lincoln moment that I chose to write about is, I think, the only time the division was even worse. So how we got out of that problem, I think the solution began in this 13-day train trip that Lincoln was on. I didn't know when I began the project now almost 10 years ago that our problems would be as deep as they are. And we have international problems, which I hope we can talk about. I'm very worried about the standing of the US in the world, as I know you are, and what it means to be an ethical leader in the world community, which is so important for the United States to fulfill that role. And I'm also very troubled about how deep the political divide is, mainly between Democrats and Republicans, but even within the two parties, it's restive, it's not settled. People are not happy for a lot of reasons. And we're racially divided, as We just saw that terrible shooting in Georgia that got into the news over the last couple days. So we're still trying after all of these decades and more than 200 years to figure out what it means to be American. And Joel and I have talked about that many, many times. So this book project has helped me a lot to reflect on that larger question. And it began in a pretty ordinary way. I was writing a series of almost blog posts. I wouldn't even call them quite articles, but short essays in the New York Times beginning around 2010, going up to about 2015, all around the 150th anniversary of our Civil War. And the idea was that we could find younger historians who were comfortable in the digital environment, could put up more articles about history in the online New York Times than they would have been able to put in the printed paper. When it started, the online New York Times was kind of like a backyard that no one cared about. So it was fine to let a bunch of Civil War historians write there. Since then, the online New York Times has really become the main deal. And it's fascinating to see now how things have changed in not that many years, where the online environment is basically everything. But I was part of a kind of digital experiment to see if history could be done well in the New York Times. And we found that it really could be, that in some ways it's a much better environment to write history. You can put up beautiful photographs, all kinds of graphics. You get instant requests, questions in from readers like we can do in this conversation today. And it was thrilling. And way back then I was thinking, what is a kind of a story I could tell well in a format that wants me to write one post a day? That was basically my job for them, was what happened 150 years ago. And I saw that Lincoln had this 13-day train trip, and I thought that is a perfect kind of a story for submitting a daily blog. I can just do, here's what Lincoln did on day one of the trip, here's what he did on day two, and we can put some photographs up of the cities he's passing through. And it turned out to be a much bit better story and a much deeper story. And for me, it ended up literally consuming 10 years of my life, because it was so deep that it was basically bottomless. And it goes into the endlessly fascinating question of who is Abraham Lincoln, who is still elusive to a biographer, even though more than 15,000 books have been written about him. Why did his speeches become so good? He'd given a few important speeches, not too many, but a few. The Lincoln-Douglas debates are important. The Cooper Union address in New York is very important, but he steps it up to an even higher level while traveling under very difficult conditions on a rapidly moving railroad through all these different cities of the upper Midwest and the North. And then how did he deal with some of the worst political problems any incoming president has ever had to deal with? He's elected with a very, very weak plurality. It's not a mandate. He has less than 40% of the vote. He has the second lowest vote of a winning presidential candidate in our history, which is amazing if you think of how famous Lincoln has become. To look at the bad hand he was dealt when he won the election. He's, after John Quincy Adams, he's the second weakest victor of a presidential race. 7 states secede after he's elected, so he's only the president-elect of half a country. And then, as I develop in the book, it was not at all certain he could even make it to Washington to become the president of a country called the United States. And believe me, I had spent many years studying this period, and I was shocked at how much new information I was able to find by really digging into journal accounts from the winter of 1860-61, private correspondence between important players like William Henry Seward, New York Senator and future Secretary of State, and Lincoln. And basically, our democracy was hanging by a thread And the idea of a country called the United States of America was also hanging by a thread, because Washington was not a very sympathetic capital to the presidential hopes of Abraham Lincoln and this very new and unformed party called the Republican Party, which was not a grand old party. It was not grand, and it was not old, and it was barely one party. It varied a lot. If you're a New England Republican, you're very different from a Illinois Republican or a Wisconsin Republican. They all have different goals, and they're barely cohering as a party. And Lincoln isn't much of a party leader. He's a kind of accidental nominee of party bosses. That's good for him, but he's not really dictating party policy. And then the situation in Washington is terrible. The Republicans are unpopular. There's another president, a Democrat, James Buchanan, who is sullen and uncooperative with Lincoln and is coming very close to recognizing the new Confederate government, which doesn't even really have a name yet, but the states have seceded away from the US. They just haven't quite formed their new government. But foreign powers are on the verge, the phrase I use a lot, on the verge of recognizing this new slave-based country without a clear name yet. And what I was shocked to discover was how close the South came to sending a pretty small set of militia soldiers. It wouldn't have been organized troops, but a couple hundred men with guns from Virginia and Maryland into the city of Washington, D.C., which was barely defended at all, and just taking over the US government, taking over the US Capitol, which included the Library of Congress and the Senate and the Supreme Court and the House. And they would have had all of the treaties of American history. They would have had the patents that dictated so much commerce. And they would have been able, there are paper records indicating this, they would have been able to call themselves the United States of America. And then Lincoln would have been a kind of rogue president-elect of something else who probably would have only been able to make it to Philadelphia. And he's the one who would have had to rename his country. I mean, no one quite knows what would have happened. But through incredible moral leadership, which gathered huge numbers of Americans behind him, including people who had not even voted for him, and physical courage. And I talk a lot about how brave he was just to stand out on that train platform day after day and night after night, where anyone could get very close to him. And that was the whole point, because he's defending democracy in its hour of need. And then one really wild ride the last night of the trip, when he went all night in an ordinary passenger car of an ordinary commuter train that went from Philadelphia through Wilmington and Baltimore, where there was a very serious assassination conspiracy to take his life, and arrived at dawn in Washington on February 23rd, 1861, and walked up the hill, Capitol Hill. And by arriving safely, I argue that he made everything possible, not just the 4 years of his presidency, which we now know very well as historians. The Civil War is one of the most important episodes in American history. But in my epilogue, I argue that so many episodes of America's moral leadership in the world and America's greatness as a country, including our late but important entry into World War I, and then our transformative role on us as well as on the world in World War II, when we, with our allies, crushed fascism, not just a few countries, but an ideology that was very powerful, and reasserted the importance of democracy, race-blind democracy, by the way, and democracy with an economic component, as FDR always articulated it, as the primary organizing idea of the world from 1945 on. FDR dies in 1945, but we know very well what he says. And I argue that if Lincoln doesn't survive his train trip and then win the Civil War, and in the process revitalize all of those ideas about democracy, and specifically the soaring language of the Declaration of Independence, which is a document about human rights. In addition to declaring the right to form a new country, it's also asserting the rights of all human beings, to foundational human rights. If Lincoln doesn't get off that train alive, I'm not sure how World War II turns out for the United States or the world. If we're fighting that war with an equally powerful Southern version of ourselves that still has either real slavery or some modernized version of wage slavery, we're not able to inspire the world's peoples to fight in World War II the way we successfully did. And I'm very aware that we've often fallen short of our own standards, and we have since then in Vietnam and Iraq. And I'm very aware that other countries often hold that up against us. But still, the fact that we won a civil war to reassert a better version of ourselves, and Lincoln's language is still important in learning how we did that, and that we stood up to fight fascism and then build the international architecture that this community of listeners knows so well, the UN, but so many of its dependent agencies, including in a time of pandemic, the World Health Organization. All of that is because people can work together, and they should work together. We solve problems more effectively when we are united internationally as well as nationally, and when we stop attacking each other for all of the well-known problems that we have. So it is a Civil War book, and it's even more specific than that. It's about 13 days only in the life of Lincoln. But I argue that by surviving those 13 days and developing the big concepts that he does develop on that trip, he gave us all the rhetoric to use in every future predicament, and we're certainly in one now.
Ted, thank you. That's a terrific, not only summary, but brings us forward to today and even into the future about, how our principles relate to the formation of not only public policy, but our, as you were saying, our role in the world. There's so many dramatic moments in the book, and I want to come back to one of them because I think it's really at the core of what you were just saying. And if I remember correctly, it's Washington's birthday, 1861, and it's when the Lincoln's train arrives in Philadelphia, and Lincoln is called to speak at the Independence Hall. And at that moment, maybe you could help the audience understand what actually comes together for Lincoln at that moment, and compare it to what was happening to his counterpart, who was also having a journey of his own through the South, Jefferson Davis. And what I took away from that was that actually what inspires the solidarity that you're talking about was the point that Lincoln came to in that famous speech in 1861 in Philadelphia. It became the rally point. It became the sort of the true north, if you will, for Lincoln, for the Union, for what the country should be.
Well, thank you, Joel, for that question. That really is the pivot of the entire book. It's a very short speech he gives inside Independence Hall on the morning of February 22nd, 1861. And it's loaded with drama. As you say, Jefferson Davis has been racing on a train of his own across the South, and he has arrived. Lincoln is still trying to get to Washington. And the night before, he's heard from a brilliant female spy in Baltimore that there's an extremely serious conspiracy involving as many as 1,000 people who will stab and shoot him when he comes through Baltimore in the transfer between two train stations, when he has to ride a horse and carriage. And so he's taken in that information the night before, pretty dark information, and he's got to go out and talk about democracy and trust between people. So it's a very heavy moment for Lincoln. But brilliantly, they have scheduled the talk for the morning of Washington's birthday, and I argue that was a triumph of something we don't always think of in 19th century history, but then as now they were thinking about the equivalent of photo ops and how to position the president-elect in as attractive a light as possible. And I argue that Southern leaders, including Davis, had just as good a claim to George Washington. George Washington is a Southerner, and Jefferson Davis had close personal ties, relatives of his and his wife's who had fought in the American Revolution more than Lincoln did. But Lincoln was smarter in the way he thought about Washington's birthday. And to talk in Independence Hall, and Washington's birthday is the second most important day of the year after the 4th of July. To talk in Independence Hall gave him a chance to talk about the Declaration of Independence, which for Lincoln is a core document. He's been talking about it for years, and he has an almost mystical attachment to that document and to specifically the second paragraph with the great soaring language. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is a lot of Lincoln's political program just in those sentences. And in fact, affirmation of the Declaration of Independence was written into the Republican platform of 1860. It's unusual that the Declaration goes into a political platform, but it was really under attack in the 1850s as Southerners were saying in more and more aggressive language, that was a mistake. That was just some boilerplate of 1776. It obviously doesn't apply to African Americans who aren't really people in the full sense of the word and are definitely not citizens in any sense. They can't get married. They don't have last names. They don't have any civil rights. That was a strong Southern position in 1860, and Jefferson Davis himself goes on record, including in his farewell speech to the US Senate, he goes out of his way to say, by the way, the Declaration of Independence does not apply to Black people. And Lincoln comes in and in his always very calming and unifying language says, there's not a political thought I have ever had that does not stem in some way from the Declaration of Independence. And it's a powerful moment. He's been traveling in his mind through some of the darkest days of the American Revolution. The day before, he's talked about Washington at Valley Forge. And he's saying, why are we all here? Why did they fight a very difficult war and go through a lot of hardship to create a country to hand off to us? And he says it wasn't merely to be separate. That was easy. It was to establish a new kind of model for the world. It was a better kind of government in which people run things for themselves. And the adversary to the Continental soldiers was a monarchical system. But in Lincoln's mind, I mean, that was still going on. Most of Europe was run by monarchies, but also just any system in which the wealthy have all the power and the poor have almost no political power. That wasn't what the founders were fighting for. And Lincoln, having grown up as poor as he did, I think felt a real sympathy for the plight of the slave. And there are a lot of complicated ways to get at his complicated racial thinking. But basically, he is, in my opinion, the greatest abolitionist in American history. He wouldn't have called himself that word in 1860 and 61 when he couldn't use that word and be elected. But he's taking big steps towards racial equality, even in this train trip. And then, as we know, he does the Emancipation Proclamation. And then at the end of the war, he calls for Black citizenship. And then all of those amendments come through and Black citizenship becomes a reality. And if he hadn't made it on that trip, I don't think any of those things would have happened. I also argue that he's purged Independence Hall, one of our most sacred historical shrines, of its own sinfulness in this story, because in the 1850s, it had become a holding cell for African Americans who were rounded up in Philadelphia, often incorrectly. Free people of color were rounded up by US Marshals and held in a holding pen on the second floor of Independence Hall before being sent into the South and back into slavery. So in a way, Lincoln's giving this building back its integrity as well as the country.
And one of the parts of the book I enjoyed so much, and again, it comes out of that scene, but it permeates through, was this sense that Lincoln felt that he was somehow communicating with the founders, that he was somehow, that they were alive in some way, and that he summoned them, and he was actually sort of speaking with them and working things out. And, you know, I presume in the way you're thinking of it too, is that others then, Lincoln then joins that pantheon and becomes kind of a source for leadership. I wanted to press you on one particular theme. We were talking a little bit about leadership. And so, you know, my simple way of understanding kind of the American DNA in terms of how we think about leadership, there's this, you know, the founders had sort of two concerns. They certainly had great concern about a king, right? The whole point of the experiment was to be a democracy, non-monarchical. So they feared the king, but they also feared the masses, right?
Yes.
They feared both. And so the whole idea of the founding documents was to somehow work that out. I'm just curious how, you know, how Lincoln, you know, so Lincoln was probably seen by many as a tyrant, right? That,
Yep.
And then, you know, later we see other American leaders seen that way. FDR seen as tyrannical, right? So, you know, how do you think about this sort of American, this DNA, if you will, this sort of anti-king idea, and how that's kind of playing out? Because I see this playing out now as part of our polarized environment that we're in. It somehow seems sort of distinctly American in a way that we're not going to be taking our direction from the central authorities.
Well, I agree with you that Lincoln felt to an unusual degree that he was communicating with the founders. And I mean that in as strange a sense as it may sound. Like, I think he almost was having private seances with them. And there is a fair amount of evidence, and I write about this, that he really tried to talk to dead people. He could hear them and they could hear him in some way that we don't fully understand. But he wrote poems as a young man about trying to communicate with the dead. He loved Edgar Allan Poe, and his law partner asked him why he liked Poe so much, and he said, because he's so gloomy. And there is a kind of dark side to Lincoln that I was very intrigued by. And I mean, because, you know, the light side of Lincoln is great, and his sense of humor and his clear understanding of our best qualities. That's all good. But there are these strange aspects to Lincoln too. So he's trying to correct. It's a kind of gyroscope that the founders created and set spinning, but it gets out of whack every generation or two. And one way it was getting out of whack in 1860 and 61 is that slavery was supposed to fade away. The founders themselves had expressed the hope that it would fade away. It was a kind of temporary inconvenience for a country talking a lot about freedom and democracy in 1776, but then it got a lot stronger. And Lincoln says that in the Cooper Union Address, that how did it get so strong when the founders wanted it to go away? Then as he comes in, although very weak at the beginning, and becomes extraordinarily strong over his 4-year presidency. I don't think any president, possible exception of FDR, ever reinvented the office itself as totally as Abraham Lincoln did. And that worried many advocates of democracy in other ways. They thought the executive is not supposed to be as strong as it is now under Lincoln. And he really reinvented what the US government was. It did 100 times what it had been doing before he came in by the end of his life and his administration. And some of those worries had reasons attached to them. He suspends the writ of habeas corpus. He arrests newspaper editors working in sensitive parts of the country. And he runs roughshod over his political opponents, but he never loses sight of the big picture, I would argue. He submits to a very difficult re-election campaign in 1864. There are moments when it looks like that's not going to go his way. He does some slightly funky things to help it go his way, including he sends soldiers back to their home districts to help in a state like Pennsylvania it could go either way. But he never suspends the election itself. And I mean, on that note, I might say parenthetically, that's a specific democratic fear that I feel in 2020, that the 2020 election is very fragile and it could be suspended or postponed or the result contested, and it's pretty easy to contest a result afterwards. So I hope all of us from both parties will keep an eye on the November election and just keep it as honest as it can be. And if we have to mail in our ballots, that's fine. There's very little need to worry about a mail-only election if it comes to that, although I hope we can vote in person. But the best thing Lincoln does, it's not just submitting to a re-election campaign, but he talks so beautifully about what democracy is, and he gives strength to democracy through his words. And his first inaugural does that beautifully. Gettysburg probably does it better than any speech in American history, although it does subtle things to kind of change the gyroscope of what he, as Gary Wills wrote in Lincoln at Gettysburg, Lincoln substitutes a version of democracy that he likes better over the one that the founders had written in. And then in his second inaugural address and in a few other minor speeches, and I found interesting some speeches to Ohio regiments in which he talks a lot about the 20th century. He talks a lot about the grandchildren of these young men and how what they're doing will make democracy safe for Americans of the 20th century.
Ted, that's a great transition into one other point I wanted to raise with you, but at this point I want to alert all of the people who are watching. We're going to have some time for some Q&A. So if you have questions you'd like to pose for Ted, please use the chat function. We're going to be moving to that. Thank you for raising this point about the future. To what extent was Lincoln thinking about democracy as an experiment, a universal experiment that might go beyond just the Union, but for the future of, the human race in that sense? Did he have that big a vision for it? And related to that, I'm curious because you mentioned the election. Today we're thinking so much about our democratic institutions. So it's not just the president, but it's, how is our society functioning? Are we moving in a progressive way in the sense of inclusivity, genuine participation, making the system work for the people, right? And so that is, an institutional question. So again, Lincoln had a lot on his plate. There was the leadership, there was the vision, all of that. But did he also connect it to the idea of the institutions of democracy and keeping those healthy?
Well, thanks again, Joel. Yeah. I think Lincoln absolutely is thinking about democracy for all people and for all time. And he says that, in fact, in the Philadelphia speech you asked me to talk about. It's a short speech, but I argue that it's the beta version of the Gettysburg Address. He's working out the ideas. He didn't have a piece of paper in his hand. He's just talking. But he says there that they were working out something. He says, there's not a sentiment in my own politics that doesn't stem from the Declaration of Independence. And then he says, they were working out a new form of government for all people, for all time, which is essentially what he says at Gettysburg in the same state 2.5 years later. So I don't think those two speeches are unrelated. Now, why Lincoln, who is also a very canny and practical politician, who knows the defects of democracy very well, why he has this kind of philosophical and nearly spiritual way of talking about democracy is kind of a mystery, because not everyone had that. And in fact, I think if you've been in politics for 20 or 30 years, you sort of go through the ritual of saying a few words about democracy, but it's not quite as elevated as it obviously was for Abraham Lincoln. And where that comes from, I'm still wrestling to figure out, and other people have been wrestling with that for a long time. But many of his contemporaries noticed that there was something unusually intense about his feelings about what is democracy, the right and the ability, two different things, of the people to govern themselves, relevance of this system to all people on earth, including people of different skin colors and religions, and then the relevance of what we are doing at any given moment towards the future. And in all of those ways, he was unusual. William Henry Seward, who was fellow Republican and his closest ally in the White House, and they co-wrote the final paragraph of the first inaugural about the better angels of our nature. He said this fascinating quote. He said, there's something very unusual about Abraham Lincoln. He appears to actually believe all of the things that he's saying. And I love that quote. And another person who said something similar, fascinating figure on the other side, Alexander Stephens, is the vice president of the Confederacy. He's from Georgia. He knows Lincoln very well. They served in the House together in the late 1840s. And they correspond in a very meaningful way during this crisis of the South seceding and Lincoln not yet president. He says they're friends, but they're on opposite sides. And he says the same thing. Lincoln actually believes all that stuff he's saying about the Declaration of Independence. He really believes it. And, it can be a danger to go too far, to be too naive and too idealistic, and to think democracy will just naturally settle on people and their lives will be ameliorated forever. I mean, we can drift into kind of some of the language. I love Eleanor Roosevelt, but Eleanor Roosevelt and Adlai Stevenson, in the exciting years following the creation of the UN, or well into the early 60s, when Adlai Stevenson is our ambassador to the UN, we now know that we have to combine idealism with pragmatism. That's very important for anyone who defends democracy, as I believe anyone in the community of the Carnegie Council wants to do. But toward that end, I find really fascinating the steps Lincoln was taking at the end of his life to get over the really big stumbling block of how to make democracy real for African Americans, which was a work in progress, to put it mildly. And yesterday, we got the news that the 1619 Project of the New York Times got a Pulitzer for its very good and very emotional writing about American history. But I personally objected to the way they described Abraham Lincoln, because I thought in a kind of unmethodical way, not looking at the full picture, they dismissed Lincoln as a racist and yet another guy on the side of the patriarchy and the oppressive system that delayed democracy for African Americans. And if you look really carefully at his life, he did an extraordinary amount to maneuver the argument into a place where, after only 4 years, it was so much further than it was when he comes in very weak on this train in 1861. And he's right on the eve of announcing forms of Black citizenship in 1865. And it's almost certainly for that reason, he announces it in his final speech, that he's murdered. He's murdered because of how brave he is on that score. So I would like people to understand how fast he was moving on the most difficult question in our history.
Thanks, Ted. That's really helpful. I'm going to turn it now to Alex Woodson. I see there are a lot of questions that have come in. So Alex, maybe you could share them with Ted.
Sure, thanks, Joel. So the first question I'll read is from David Speedy, who's our former U.S. Global Engagement Director at Carnegie Council. David writes, your book includes some lesser known figures for most who are quite heroic in their role on Lincoln's behalf, such as Winfield Scott, a Virginian, a Washington insider of sorts, but a Unionist. As we know, Lincoln as president built a team of rivals, but how, as a callow congressman from Illinois, did Lincoln inspire, against all odds it would seem, a diverse group of people dedicated to seeing him safely brought to office, even many who had not voted for him?
Oh, what a great question. I try to complicate the story at every point. I try to show how many pro-Southern people were in the northern cities that he was obligated to travel through, including NYC, which was filled with pro-Southern agitators, politicians, businessmen. But then I try to equally show how many brave Southerners showed up to defend Lincoln and the United States. And Winfield Scott is a Virginian. Sam Houston in Texas is pro-union, and those guys were really important at a time when it could go either way. And I think one crucial thing they did is, well, Scott does a lot. He keeps Washington, D.C. from falling into the hands of this Southern country that doesn't even have a name yet. So he keeps Washington as the capital of the United States of America, a country that is waiting for its president to come in. Crucially, Virginia stays in the US. This isn't always remembered, but Virginia is still in the US at the time Lincoln takes his inaugural address. And that was really important for keeping Maryland in, and Kentucky and Missouri. Virginia does go out, but it was really important that it stayed in during the time of Lincoln's train trip. Those Southerners who stood up for the Union are crucial. And how Lincoln does it? Well, it's largely through his words. And he did something remarkable then, and even more remarkable in 2020. He didn't talk about himself too much. It's a radical thing to hear about in 2020. But as president-elect, he kept saying, the cause is bigger than me. I'm just the temporary occupant of this office. I'm going to do the best I can to keep our country and the ideals behind it together. If you don't like my policies, you can vote me out. He's already saying that on the train trip in. And I think that appealed to the very large numbers of Americans who had not voted for him. So as I said, he's got only 39% of the vote, but he's saying, I'm just holding this office temporarily. We're in this for a much bigger cause. We're in it for the cause of eternal democracy for all people. And so by not talking about himself and by including other people who are politically opposed to him as part of his constituency, I think he made a smart, idealistic argument, but also it was shrewd politics, because he helped people to think, we want this guy to have a chance. And just having a chance was all he needed to do what he did.
Thanks, Ted. The next question is from Steve Hibbard. He writes, Ted, thank you for your wonderful remarks. You've commented on how strong Lincoln became as an executive, including running roughshod over his political opponents. But is it a singular feature of this presidency that leaders of the president's party fear or are remarkably reluctant to question in public the president's actions? If so, why?
Well, yes, my personal feeling is I regret the absence of a strong and principled Republican Party standing up for its historic values against a president who doesn't even remember what those values once were, and is really a party of his own. I would say he was a kind of Democrat for a long time in his earlier career, and then became a Republican for some reasons I understand, and some I don't. But I miss what used to be called a liberal Republican, and I'm from New England, and we had a lot of them, and they were wonderful people. In my home state of Rhode Island, we had a great senator named John Chafee, whom I used to vote for. I also lived in Massachusetts, and there was you will all remember Elliot Richardson, the hero of the Watergate era, who ran for senator, and the very first vote I ever cast was for Elliot Richardson. And I remembered often in the writing of this book, I had Republican grandparents who were liberal New England Republicans, and I wish more people like that were around. And they were good. They're good in both parties. Dissenters are good in both parties. I mean, we have them in the Democratic Party, but there are none in the Republican Party. So yes, I was thinking about the current moment, but I also made a decision early on. I wasn't going to talk about 2020. I wanted readers to draw their own conclusions for a lot of reasons. I mean, I hope people, a diverse community of readers will read the book. And also, I was so focused on my moment, I just didn't want to get off topic. I wanted to stay on 1861, and then there's a brief epilogue about 1865. But I think Lincoln himself would say a Republican Party without any memory of American history or any set of ethical principles that it believes in, except the right to make money and despoil the environment, and to always be thinking about short-term gain over long-term benefits, and always be thinking about individual gain over community benefits. That's not an ethical party, and it's not a party that has anything to do with the Republican Party that Abraham Lincoln helped to create.
Okay, we'll go to another question. This one we actually got in by email last week. So it is from John C. Stratakis. He writes, "We seem to be in another one of those freedom versus security moments throughout US history, from Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts, Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, Wilson's Espionage and Sedition Acts, Roosevelt's Japanese internment, and Bush's Patriot Act. Our leaders have often reacted to crisis by suspending individual rights. How does the ethical leader strike the right balance if he believes the risk to the nation justifies a temporary suspension of rights?" And ethical and temporary are both in quotes.
Yeah, great question. These are all so good. We are in such a moment, and we Democrats, I'm now a Democrat, and basically I have been my entire life, except for a couple of those votes for New England Republicans. We have to be careful that whatever we think now in the current moment, we hold true to if a Democrat is elected president. I mean, that's an important principle for all Americans, is to stand up for the same ethical standards no matter who is president. So to give President Trump the benefit of the doubt, these are really hard questions. How to save people right now means removing certain protections. And one way we might be safer is if we let Google and Apple follow everywhere we go on our phones all day long. I understand why they would want to do it, so they could track anyone who has the disease, but it's obviously troubling for anyone who cares about civil liberties. So it's not just that we need to keep an eye on the federal government, we need very much to keep an eye on the private sector and on foreign actors who mean us great harm and who are very skillful at working in the digital environment. So we have to be careful of all of the above. And one way I think we could do a better job, and here I think we really are falling down on the job, is if our president asked these questions in a reasonable way and then helped us to answer them in a reasonable way. And instead we get this crazy pattern of on again, off again attacks, recriminations, bizarre self-justifications, rewriting of history. One minute, the governors have to do everything. The next minute, the president is in charge of all the governors and they have no right to do anything. It's really confusing. Now, that actually is an interesting question, and Lincoln wrestled with it too. What do the governors do? What does the president do? And that was one of the many ways Lincoln worked out how the executive could function more efficiently. It turned out governors were not very good at raising armies. And so the executive needed to step up to fight a war. It was an emergency. And so he did. And to give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt, that is a reasonable question to ask, but he doesn't then answer in a reasonable way. He's all over the map saying, I have no responsibility, I have total responsibility. And it's confusing. And there are ways to answer it better. And I would love to see a presidential commission appointed with former Republican and Democratic presidents and America's best minds from the health sector and university presidents and CEOs and a head of a labor union, you know, the best of America. And we know we have those strengths. And instead, it's always these depressing lobbyists and former dog breeders who are given very exalted titles in the Trump White House. And then when we barely know their name, they're removed from the White House, maybe because they were doing their job well. So it's just all so confusing.
Okay, thanks, Ted. We have a lot more questions. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them. Dorothy Hurley has two pretty quick ones that are somewhat
I'll try to
connected.
be faster in my answers too.
Okay. So she writes, do you have any thoughts on what role Lincoln would have played in a post-presidency? And somewhat connected, given the seriousness of our current situation, should our ex-presidents be speaking out more?
Well, those are great questions. The first one is, I mean, part of it is easy. I don't think he would have messed up as badly as Andrew Johnson, his vice president, did, who quickly got into trouble with a very powerful Congress and didn't like the pace at which Reconstruction was happening and tried to slow it down, and then was impeached but not removed. And it was a big mess. I think Lincoln would have handled Reconstruction much more skillfully. He might not have been as fast paced as I was saying a few minutes ago, but he would have made sure it happened in a way that all Americans could have agreed it was the right, or well, I shouldn't say all, but I think it would have been more with more consensus than it was at the time. And I also think he would have brought in the South in a much gentler, more careful way. And so he would have handled those two the relationship with Congress and the way the South came back into the country. I think he would have handled more skillfully than Andrew Johnson did. And I'm sorry, Alex, what was the second question?
The second question was, should ex-presidents be speaking out more about the current situation?
I have to say yes, I think they should be. I understand their great respect for the office, but I think we're a little lost as a country right now, and we need their expertise. And there is a precedent. Presidents Hoover and Truman, as I recall, now and then gave remarks critical of Democratic presidents. And I think former Democratic presidents have done the same. So there are ways they can do it in a thoughtful manner. I just saw this morning, I think, that Barack Obama is going to give an online address to thousands of graduating high school seniors. So that'll be something. But it has felt a little bit one-sided that Barack Obama is a kind of punching bag every day for Donald Trump, and he never answers. And it would be nice to hear him answer back.
Okay, I think maybe time for one more question. This is something that I'm interested in as well. So I'm sorry that we can't get to all of them, but this is from Joe Fewer. He writes, can you say a word about how leadership was displayed by President Wilson and others during the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919?
And let me just say for a second, I'm happy to take questions by email if you didn't get your question in. And the Carnegie Council has my email, or I can even tell you it's ted_widmer@brown.edu. And I'm happy to answer emails this afternoon if that helps. But well, Wilson is a complicated guy, and we at the Carnegie Council did a series of podcasts last year that was really fun, talking about all the events of 1919, sort of the wrapping up of the war, which ends in late 1918, and then the ways, in expected and a lot of unexpected ways, the world adjusted to peace. And Wilson isn't that strong on the pandemic, and America isn't that strong on the pandemic. And it's really a missing story from that time. The big story in the history books, and I have to admit in our series last year, is the attempt to rebuild the world order, the Treaty of Versailles, some things that were good about it, a lot of ideas that then go into the United Nations a generation later, some things that were bad about it. It failed to get through the US Senate. It allowed a lot of European bad behavior in colonized parts of the world. It really set unattainable rates of reparations for the Germans and doomed the world to another war a generation later. But we alluded in a few moments to the pandemic and didn't really take it head on. That's a little bit because the pandemic peaked in the fall of 1918 and our series was about 1919. But also the history books, and I am guilty of the same thing, have generally just told the story of international foreign policy without telling the story of the pandemic. And I think we should, we all needed to do a better job. And the American history textbooks I've looked at barely mention the pandemic, and a lot of people died, 50 million people. So that was itself a form of foreign policy and domestic policy, but largely my sense is that governors then as now were trying to establish quarantines and getting camps available for people to go stay at if they had the disease, and putting out public information, but it was not a federal activity in 1919. Wilson, by the way, is beginning to suffer from his physical impairment that will really hit badly in the fall of 1919. So he's just so distracted by Versailles and the work of diplomacy that he isn't really available for pandemic work. But I think that was a historic failing of his. And we need to maybe rewrite what we think of as foreign policy, because health policy should be a part of that.
Ted, we're coming to the top of the hour, so I have to wrap things up. Thank you very much. Just a couple of points just to wrap things up. One thing we didn't get to, but is such a wonderful sort of frame for the book, is the sort of Homeric aspects of it. The idea that it's a journey, not only the 13 days, but also the broader journey. And what I really took away from the book was just the journey of not only Lincoln, but democracy itself, and that we're all part of it. And another thing that I've taken away from my conversations with you is that it's always been a struggle. I think we can sometimes sort of feel bad about, our polarization or the political difficulties that we may have. And it really may seem like a dark hour, but one of the things that I've really appreciated from all of your work in American history is the sort of portraying that realism, that genuine struggle, people overcoming things, but also maintaining some sense of optimism, and that optimism based on a set of principles, and that those principles really do matter. And I was just thinking too about Lincoln, the sort of endless sort of thinking about Lincoln, how this leader could wage a war, in such a bloody war, in such a difficult war, and then end it in a way that was hopeful for a magnanimous peace. The idea of charity to all and malice toward none, that he was able to hold those in his mind together. And it's just, anyway, still so much inspiration. So I hope we can revisit some of these themes in a different way as we move forward. But
Absolutely.
thank you for all of this. And
Thank you.
I just want to wrap things up by letting people know that we have recorded this, and you can have access to it. You can share it with friends on the Carnegie Council YouTube site and also our own website. And we will reconvene next Wednesday at noon. And we're going to have another conversation about leadership in times of crisis with Colonel Jeff McCausland, who's another Carnegie Council Fellow, former Dean of the U.S. Army War College. So Ted, I didn't know if you wanted to just say a word before we wrap it up.
Well, I just want to thank you and the council and all the people who support the council for keeping the idealistic part of this message in close focus, including what we do wrong. We do things wrong a lot, because that part often gets forgotten in Washington, D.C. And I'm just grateful for the council for standing up for ethics. They're so important. And the Homeric quotations, I was a little embarrassed. I thought it might be too pretentious, but I also thought it said something, and I'm glad if you liked it. It was about going home in two senses. One is going home to our best ideas as a people. By getting to Washington, he gets home in a sense. He allows the American idea to stay intact. And then at the end of the book, he's brought home. He's no longer alive, but he's brought home for burial in Springfield, but still very alive as a martyr and as the best exemplar of our ideas in our history. So thank you.
Good. Thanks so much. Thank you to everyone who watched, and have a great week.
Okay.
Bye-bye.